As yet, all the stars that wheel in the heaven were not, nor yet, though one should inquire, could aught be heard of the sacred race of the Danai. Apodenian Arcadians alone existed. Arcadians who lived even before the moon. That passage is from the Argonautica written by Apollonius of Rhodes. Although extraordinarily poorly read by myself, what is interesting is that for some weird reason, in ancient Greek mythology, there is a time where the moon does not exist, and the human race does. Ancient Greek history records a time to where humanity was essentially alive and well while there was no moon in the sky. Not only is the claim made by Greeks that there was a period of time to where there was no moon, but they even go so far as to say all the other spheres or the other planets in the sky had not found their current orbit. Now, if you think about it, that's pretty crazy that something like that was being written back in the day, supposedly. And yes, I realize that there's going to be issues with, like, who the hell really was Apollonius? Did he really exist back in ancient Greece? All of that stuff. And I'm not going to dive too much into the chronological factor and the possibility that some of this stuff was not written back in, 300 BC or whatever, but that it was actually written during the Middle Ages. Let's just put that to the side for a second. I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on the moon. So, as a historian, you might be wondering why the hell we should ever care about the moon, especially if you are coming from the mainstream perspective. Because the mainstream perspective is simple. The moon has been in orbit around the Earth for 10 bajillion years, it has not moved at all, and all of humanity would have only known a period of time with the moon in its current orbit. That is essentially what a mainstream historian believes when they start to look at ancient mythologies, not only of ancient Greece, but pretty much of any culture in existence. This is a problem because we find a situation all over this planet to where ancient cultures are constantly recording a time when the moon did not exist. And then it gets more interesting because they also record a time to where the moon was placed in its current orbit. Now, a mainstream historian has nothing they can work with when they look at something like this. And the reason why is simple. Well, there's a lot of reasons why, but the basic reason is they have been indoctrinated with the theory of uniformity. They believe astronomers in what, astronomers have concluded with respect to how long the moon has been in orbit around Earth. And of course, if you pair all of that with the fact that your average historian is going to not do any real research with respect to real astronomy, real physics, any of those kind of crazy things that you would really need to fully understand the orbital mechanics of the moon, they just blindly believe that the moon has been sitting there for billions of years, orbiting the Earth, and it has been like this unchanged for that entire period of time. You know what? It's basically the same exact problem that we have with mainstream Egyptologists relative to, say, something like the pyramids. So right now, Egyptologists have precisely zero structural engineering skills to their name. They do not go to school for any kind of engineering. They do not sit there and get degrees for that. They are not over there, practicing any kind of real structural engineering. But Egyptologists have no problem telling us exactly how the pyramids were built. They have no actual scientific information to back it up. They have no schooling to back it up. They have no experience to back up their claims. They just say this because it happens to fall under Egyptology. So anything that falls under Egyptology, the pyramids, tombs, whatever, it doesn't matter what it is. It does not matter what kind of crazy thing it is. As long as it falls under Egyptology, the Egyptologist that has been granted the power of authority by the state automatically knows exactly how everything was done, and you are not allowed to question it. This is how academia is run. Is it really intelligent to let an Egyptologist with precisely zero engineering background tell us how some kind of a megastructure like the pyramid was built? And of course, you better have said no. So when a historian approaches one of these mythologies to where the people are talking about a time without a moon, and then of course a time when the moon is placed into orbit, your average historian has no tools whatsoever to deal with this situation on a scientific and intellectual level. They don't have the qualifications. The skills do not exist. You are not going to go to an Egyptologist and ask them, hey, can you please build a skyscraper for us? I mean, you know how the pyramids were built, so all this other kind of stuff should be child's play to you. You're not going to do that because on some level or another, either consciously or subconsciously, that going to an Egyptologist for any kind of structural advice is stupid, right? You're not doing it. Nobody does it. There is not a single architect on this planet who has gone to an Egyptologist and been like, oh, hey, dude, I know you know everything about the pyramids. Can you please help us with our structural engineering problems? I mean, you're just so smart. I mean, nobody's doing that. And nobody's doing that because it's stupid. So it's the exact same problem that we are going to have when a mainstream historian starts to look back at ancient cultures as histories. And when these cultures talk about, the heavens and the sky and the planets and all these movements and all these events, your average historian just has no real way of dealing with any of this stuff. So they immediately fall back on their basic training. And of course, their basic training tells them that anything that our ancestors claimed happened, especially if it deals with the gods and any kind of catastrophism or anything, anything at all with planets or whatever, they've all been trained to immediately discard all of it as fiction. And that's exactly what they do. A mainstream historian is never going to make any further progress with respect to understanding history for this simple reason. The fact that they are not willing to learn anything new, to branch out beyond, basically their general school of thought, and they're not willing to incorporate all kinds of new sciences, new discoveries, etc., etc. The fact that they are not willing to do any of this, they're done. I mean, modern mainstream historians are essentially useless at this point in time. Anytime you go and pick up a new book by any of these people, you're not going to get any new information because everything that will be written in their books or their papers or their theses or whatever the hell they're working on, it's all just going to regurgitate the exact same conclusion at the end of the day that was already decided, decades ago. You're not going to get any different conclusions. There is not going to be a paradigm shift in history. All right, so okay. All right. So that's what historians are doing. That's what we have to deal with. So how are we ever going to make progress in trying to understand what the hell happened in our past if that is all we have to work with? The good news is that we can completely ignore mainstream historians and we can push them to the side. I'm not saying they don't have some evidence we need. Yeah, they've got some here and there. You just have to be careful and don't waste your time either, right? You can get lost in their volumes of garbage. I mean, it's insane how much crap they've written. Just libraries of useless garbage that all says the exact same thing over and over, just in different ways. Okay, you get the point. So, what does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with an open landscape in which we can re-evaluate our ancestors' histories, incorporate new sciences and new scientific discoveries, and maybe try and come to a different conclusion with respect to our true past. Because right now, it's pretty obvious that the mainstream is off their rocker. They are not providing adequate answers. They are not producing anything that really works with any of the stuff that we are finding relative to the evidence that we now have. And they certainly are not jiving with any of the histories that have been recorded by ancient cultures all over the planet. So the mainstream becomes almost completely useless. I mean, what are we supposed to do with these people? I mean, these guys are not looking for any of the answers, and to make matters even worse, they are completely disrespecting all of the stuff that our ancestors went out of their way to record. I think that's probably one of the worst aspects of this, is that modern day historians, they completely take a dump right on the heads of all of our ancestors who went out of their way to try and record all of this stuff so that we in the future could look at it and be like, oh yeah, cool, maybe we should avoid this, or we should look out for that, or whatever. Instead of doing that, mainstream historians simply say that our ancestors were stupid monkeys and that we do not need to pay attention to any of it. Well, I completely disagree. When we start to look back at a lot of these ancient cultures, we do find a period in time to where people claim the moon did not exist, and then the moon did exist. Now, this is, you would think this would be something you would pay attention to. Because right now, the reality is in astronomy, or cosmology if you want, it doesn't matter. Cosmology is not even a real science. I should just say astronomy. Whatever, cosmology. Anyways, the point is, we do not have any actual evidence to support the claims of modern day astronomers relative to things like how the moon formed. And we already talked about that on the previous episode of this little two-part whatever thing. We already disproved that NASA's version of where the moon came from, how it was formed, and how it got into orbit is completely wrong. It's not scientific. They are operating completely on theoretical garbage, and essentially their explanation does not work. And we proved that. It's done. So we can get rid of that crap. But what does that really mean? If we can discard something like NASA's explanation for where the moon came from, then what do? Well, the next best thing we could do, of course, and the better thing that we should have been doing in the first place, is that we can just go and look and see what our ancestors said about the moon. Now, if you're wondering why we need to discuss the moon and why we need to figure out, where it came from, not necessarily how it was formed, though we'll start with that and we'll go over a couple of ideas, I think. But the reason why the moon is so important to understand is because the moon really does pose a problem, generally speaking, for humanity. As I covered in the first episode of this show, the moon is a weird thing that exists in our lives. We all take the moon for granted nowadays, but the reality is everything about the moon is really weird. And it's really weird to a point to where it's almost as if the moon plays a higher function in humanity than people generally want to give it credit for. Now, I realize that, astrologically, people give credit to the moon, and you can get into some weird metaphysics, and I understand that. But I don't mean it on that level. I mean it on a scientific, physical level. The moon's mere existence seems to play a much deeper functioning role with respect to everyday humanity than I think a lot of people are willing to give it credit for. And by that I mean, the moon really does seem like it is governing some kind of an aspect of our lives, of our existence. And if it's doing that, that leads to other questions, like, okay, how and why? Why is it that something like the moon has this apparent control over humanity? Now, I don't mean that the moon is a sentient object that's looking down on us and laughing at our pain and throwing rocks at us when we're not looking. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that for some weird reason, the moon actually seems to have an effect on biology here on Earth. And it's more than just maybe some kind of a pseudo-gravitational effect. It actually seems like the moon is connected not only to humans, but generally life on the planet, and actually seems to govern certain aspects of it. Alright, it's kind of out of scope of the talk, and I'm just rambling. But anyway, that's crazy! Like, why does the moon even possibly have any kinds of effect on life like it does? Because right now you can go and you can find all kinds of science that relates to the moon having an effect on humans and governing, actually controlling aspects of our biology. That really does say something, right? I mean, maybe that is an insight into some of the older stories that we look back on, like the Sumerian stuff, with how, say, maybe humans were created by other beings or something, and perhaps, the moon is here for an artificial reason. Alright, I'm rambling. Here, let's go over the basics of the moon, and let's start at the beginning, and then let's see where it takes us. Alright, so in the first episode, we got rid of all the garbage mainstream concepts of the moon, like where they think it came from, the accretion disk model. The accretion disk model has no successful predictions to its name. It employs the weakest force in the universe, or at least essentially the weakest force in the universe, and that is gravity, to try and explain how all of that, small little dust particles would somehow magically come together and form a planet. Right? It's stupid, so we can discard all of that. Anyway, mainstream is garbage. So it begs the question then, okay, what other ideas or what other possibilities are there that explain scientifically where the moon came from, and then ultimately ended up where it is today? So, we'll start at the beginning. How the hell do you form a planet? Where does that come from? If the accretion disk model is not accurate, if that does not work, right, and we've discarded it scientifically, what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with real science, and, luckily enough, there have been really good scientists out there that have been working on this exact problem for a while. This is not a new situation, by the way, right? The formation of planets using alternative theories, this stuff has been going on forever. However, you're probably not familiar with it simply because the mainstream does not entertain any other theory other than the one that it currently holds as the unquestionable truth, right? You're not allowed to do anything else with any other theory, because the way the mainstream operates is that once it has its own belief system locked down, that's all it's going to do. That's all it's going to support. And you're a crazy conspiracy theorist if you come with any kind of an alternative scientific explanation. How dare you even try to ask a question that goes against the mainstream zeitgeist, right? You're not allowed to do that. So we're gonna do that because I don't care about mainstream scientists. Mainstream scientists, they can suck my... The formation of planets is directly related to the formation of the moon. Right? I mean, the moon is essentially a planetoid. It would probably have been created the exact same way something like Earth or Mars would have been created, so far as we can tell. And I know there's those of you out there who are already going, no, it's hollow, it's a space station, and all of that stuff. And while I can't, directly prove you wrong, and I don't know, who knows, maybe it is a kind of space station, even if it's a real planet, right? You could technically do that, I'm just saying. But anyway, let's just stick with what we can kind of do as scientists, and let's look at real science and something that we can actually kind of even test almost, and let's see if there's another at least basic explanation for how the moon and the planets would have been created. One of the more promising directions is directly related to plasma physics. So plasma physics maintains that stars are not thermonuclear in nature. And it's not just plasma physics that maintains that. Anybody with an IQ above 75 should have figured that out a long time ago. And it's funny, even if you believe in the thermonuclear model right now, I guarantee it, when you first heard it, you probably doubted it at some psychological level. Either consciously, directly consciously, you were just like, wait, what the hell are you talking about? How the hell do you sustain essentially infinite atomic explosion? What? You probably were thinking like that, or at the very least, subconsciously, something probably did not line up, right? I mean, the thermonuclear model is just a bunch of trash theoretical equations that were literally pulled out of their asses, mainstream, physicists' asses, to try and explain what the mainstream was currently holding true relative to what would power a star. It's interesting, the star formation thing. I know we're talking about the moon, but as a side note, one of the reasons why, or the main reason why, the thermonuclear model even exists at all is simply because relativity got popular, right? With the atomic bomb and all of that crap. It was suddenly in vogue to follow thermonuclear physics. What that meant was that everything had to be an atomic explosion. Now, the mainstream ate this up, and now that's why we think that's where stars come from. And of course, even alternative researchers now, they eat it up too, right? Whenever they look at something like Mars or something, now it's like, oh, I think there was a thermonuclear war on Mars. And the only reason why people say that is because that's a low-level thought process. People are just grabbing what they believe is real science. The thermonuclear model is absolute garbage, and there's also no reason to assume that there is all these atomic weapons being used on Mars. There is infinitely better explanations for why Mars looks the way it does, and we've covered that on this channel. But even if you ignored my channel, there's still no reason to believe that everybody was launching nuclear weapons at each other over there. Who knows what kind of weapons they could have been using if it was, what those guys say. I'm just saying, just putting it into context. Okay, anyway. So, stars are important, though, because it's a good chance, or there is a good chance, that stars are responsible for the creation of planets. And I don't mean, when they go supernova or whatever, and then, eventually the accretion disk model. That's not what I mean. Because remember, if a star is not thermonuclear in nature, that means there's something else powering a star, and that something else is a Birkeland current. Now, it's not just any star that could create a planet, although it's potentially possible. Before I go further with this, I don't have a specific answer. We're going to give you guys, or I'm going to give you guys some possible scientific answers, but this is still an open question. So don't think that this is settled science and there's nothing for you to do. You could be the one that figures this stuff out, right? I mean, this stuff that I tell you right now, it might inspire you to go and make the discovery of a lifetime, and then the government will come and capture you and kill you because you became too smart, right? I mean, that could be in your future. I'm just saying. All right, so stars are important, but not just any star. It looks like the only two stars right now that could potentially build a planet would be a red dwarf star or a brown dwarf star. Now, a red dwarf star and a brown dwarf star are essentially just balls of plasma. There are no thermonuclear explosions going on here. It's just a ball of plasma being powered by a Birkeland current. Now, a red dwarf star or a brown dwarf star is a relatively low potential mass of plasma. So it sits there, it's being powered by a Birkeland current. Now, inside the brown dwarf and the red dwarf, what might be potentially happening is that as this plasma is building up in a Z-pinch area, what you're going to have is the buildup of all kinds of miscellaneous materials that are being generated inside the brown or red dwarf star. Now, on this scale, remember, brown dwarfs and red dwarfs, they're huge. I mean, these are not little things, right? These guys are pretty damn huge. Earth is a very small speck compared to a brown or red dwarf. So, what's going on inside of these dwarf stars is that as this material starts being generated due to an anode-cathode situation, what's going on is that material will begin to coalesce within the brown or red dwarf star. As this material begins to coalesce, it will coalesce relative to the electrical environment. What that means is that the material will self-organize into layers. These layers will slowly build up on one another within the star, and then once that new planet that has just been built up within that brown or red dwarf star gets too large and the electrical environment can no longer sustain that particular body, what happens is that star kicks out the planet. This may be where planets come from. They might be ejected either cores of red or brown dwarf stars, or they could just be material building up, rotating around the core. It doesn't necessarily have to be the core, but it's interesting to think about. Now, I don't know which one it is. For all I know, it could be both. I have no idea. But it certainly seems like that's the case. Now, if that sounds crazy, what's interesting is that you can go and you can look at plasma experiments and you can see that kind of stuff kind of happening on an extremely small scale, right? We can't replicate, a brown dwarf or a red dwarf star, but the principles are there and they are testable. To make it even more interesting, Our ancestors in the past, when our Earth was orbiting Saturn, like they claim, remember, our ancestors do not claim that our current sun was the original sun. They claim that Saturn was our original sun. And I don't mean the planet Saturn in the sense that we see it today. Saturn would have been a brown dwarf star during that period of time that Earth was orbiting it. And of course, bad stuff happened, and eventually we were kicked out of the Saturnian orbit. And then Saturn, its Birkeland current and electrical environment were kind of, not cut off, but it was slowed down. The potential was lessened, let's put it like that. And it essentially shrunk down to what we see as Saturn nowadays. Anyway, while all of that stuff was going on, and I've made other videos about that, just go look up Saturn theory, or if you want to go to a real channel, go find a real channel that talks about it. As that happens, one of the things that our ancestors claimed they saw was they saw Venus being spat out of the brown dwarf Saturn. They all, for whatever reason, record Venus being born. And Venus, so far as I'm aware, if anybody else can show evidence for another planet doing this, I'd love to see it. That would be awesome. But so far as I'm aware, Venus is the only planetary body that our ancestors claim they witnessed being born. Because there are points in really ancient history to where Venus simply does not exist. The planet's just not there, and then during a certain period of time, all of a sudden, it's born out of Saturn, right? Whatever name for that god is being used in relation to Saturn, that's where Venus comes out of. Right? That's it, right? So we have scientific evidence that might support that this is how planets are born, and we have potential eyewitness testimonies of actually watching a planet being spit out of a brown dwarf star. So I would imagine that the moon may have come from some kind of a situation like this. Now, how long ago did that happen? I have no idea. It does not appear that any of our ancestors watched the moon actually be born. Our ancestors, however, do claim that they watched the moon being placed into orbit. Now that's fascinating. I mean, I don't care who you are, as a historian or even as a cosmologist or an astronomer, the fact that our ancestors all over this planet have a recollection of a time to where there was no moon, and then suddenly they watched the moon being placed into orbit, and some of them even tend to know why the moon was placed into orbit. I mean, you would think that you would pay attention to that. I don't know. You would think that your ears would perk up, right? I mean, you would think that as a historian, if you find tons of ancient civilizations talking about an event like this going down, I don't know. You think you'd stop and you'd start paying attention to that. However, mainstream doesn't do any of that, right? Mainstream, they completely write off all of ancient history as just quackery, insane, jumbled garbage, because our ancestors were stupid and they needed some kind of an explanation for the moon, and that's the explanation, right? I don't know, some god put the moon in there, and I don't know, they're all monkeys, or they're stupid. We can just ignore all of their stories, because mainstream cosmologists already know everything anyway, so there's no reason for us to use our brains and think for ourselves and maybe actually come to a different conclusion that would actually lead us to the truth, so that we could start figuring out who the hell we are as humans and maybe change it. Okay, all right. So we're going to have to ignore mainstream historians as well as mainstream cosmologists, because they don't want to pay attention to what's right in front of their faces. So why do we have a situation to where cultures all over this planet have a story of the moon being placed into orbit? Well, we can just listen to what they talk about, and then we can get our answer. If you go and you start to research a lot of what ancient cultures talk about relative to the moon showing up, you're going to find more than two different answers for why the moon shows up. But what you will find is that there are two major reasons that the moon is placed into orbit across all of the cultures on this planet. And what these two reasons are is, the first reason is for balance. A lot of the cultures say that there needed to be some kind of a balance on Earth after a particular catastrophe hit our planet. Now, that catastrophe, I'm not sure which catastrophe they might be talking about. That, in my opinion, is still up in the air. But if any of you actually have maybe a good idea of which catastrophe it was, I'm all ears. But if I had to guess, I would probably say that it's the Venus event. That was the event that needed the moon to be put into place to rebalance the Earth's orbit and the Earth's new wobble. Because Earth was not wobbling pre-Venus event, right? Venus, does a few flybys of Earth and absolutely devastates the planet. And it's not just the physical crust of the planet that it destroys. I mean, it completely alters the Earth, and it potentially gave Earth its wobble. So potentially, the moon could have been placed in orbit around Earth to try to rectify that situation so that the Earth did not, keep, maybe even continuously turning over. Because don't forget, during the Venus event, all cultures talk about the Earth, quote unquote, flipping over, right? I mean, that's what they say. Now, to what extent it flipped over, how it flipped over, was it a spinning top situation? Was it just the poles? I mean, well, I guess it would have had to have been more than the poles, because everybody describes the night sky reversing. And it happened several times according to everybody as well. Anyway, so Earth was in a bad way. So if the moon showed up, for whatever magical reason, and maybe we'll talk about that in a sec, the moon could have potentially been the factor that stops the Earth from its chaotic wobble and rolling that we would have experienced had the moon not shown up to give us that kind of a balance. So when our ancestors talk about the moon giving Earth a balance, they mean that literally, and most of them talk about it like that too. This is not a this is not a euphemism. They're not saying, oh yeah, it's some sort of metaphysical balance between the sun and the moon. Some of the histories will read like that, so just be careful. And don't forget, a lot of ancient histories have even been corrupted by the cultures themselves over time. So you got to be careful with that stuff. So always try to find the oldest version of the story that you can find. Don't try to look at the newer versions, because the newer versions are easily corruptible even by the original cultures. Just an FYI. Anyway, so balance, right? Everybody says balance, and these cultures meant it because they had just gone through some insane catastrophes. The moon shows up and gives Earth some stability. Now, of course, we still have our wobble today, but we're okay, right? I mean, yeah, we get our seasons now, and, we bounce back and forth a little bit. It's funny, if you guys can go find a picture or an animation of the Earth wobbling back and forth, play that like in advanced speed, like speed it up by like 300, and it's insane how crazy our wobble is. You watch the Earth just bouncing back and forth in this wobble, and you're like, dude, we're gonna flip over. Are you out of your mind? It's hilarious how crazy our wobble is. It just doesn't happen quick enough for us to truly appreciate how screwed up our planet is, right? Earth is absolutely a messed up planet. We are not on this nice, happy, peaceful place. We are in an absolute hellscape that is still going on to this day. Okay, anyway, so there's the balance aspect. Now, there's one other major reason that our ancestors will claim that the moon was put into place for, and that would be for time-keeping purposes. Now, this makes sense, because when the moon shows up, this would be when we start to find all kinds of lunar-based calendars showing up. Remember, there's a point in time to where there are no such thing as lunar-based calendars. Lunar-based calendars all show up at essentially the exact same time in history. and there's a point to where they literally don't exist for a long time. Now, mainstream historians will say that the moon calendar or the lunar calendar never existed before this because everybody was just stupid monkeys, right? Our ancestors, they couldn't really calculate the moon. They were stupid. I mean, yes, even though they were building things like, Baalbek and the pyramids and all these crazy things, they were still too stupid to calculate the year using the moon. So, the calendar eventually shows up, but, it takes some time. That is their perspective, and that's a stupid perspective. Another problem or another interesting fact is that the lunar calendar shows up at the same time on the planet. It would be one thing if like one or two cultures kind of did it simultaneously, fine, whatever, you can statistically write that off. But when the entire planet starts using lunar calendars at exactly the same time, yeah, we have a problem. All right, we've got an issue, especially if you are a mainstream historian, because mainstream historians are very adamant at telling us that all of the cultures all over this planet had no contact with each other. Right? North America was not talking to Australia. And yet, for some weird reason, everybody has the lunar calendar at the exact same point in time. How the hell does that happen if people are not communicating with one another? Well, if we look at just what they say, we can lay it out. I mean, everybody says the moon shows up at a certain point in time, then that's why everybody suddenly can use the lunar calendar. That makes sense. It makes scientific sense, and it makes historical sense. We can actually just kind of move on from there. We can just admit that, yeah, all right, the moon is a newer body to our planet. Now, real quick, I'm saying there's all these cultures that are making this claim. What cultures make this claim? I mean, we have everybody from Greeks making this claim. We have Hindus making this claim. We have Mesopotamians making this claim. Chinese make this claim. Native Americans make this claim. Norse is all over this in their mythology. We have African myths all over the place talking about this. We have Mesoamerican mythologies talking about this. We have Aborigines talking about this. Polynesians have this exact kind of a history. It's everywhere. I mean, it is literally the entire planet. Now, for people who don't like to hear this, it's not my problem. Don't get mad at me. I'm just telling you guys what everybody says in the ancient past. All right, this is not me making something up. I am not having some kind of a crazy schizo dream and then making a video. This is what they say. So if you have a problem with all of this, you go talk to those cultures. Don't even talk to me about it. I'm just relaying what they say. The only difference between me and a mainstream historian is that I am going to take them seriously because there is no reason not to. So that brings us to the lunar calendar. Now, we can do like 10 shows on this, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But what's interesting is that everybody makes the claim that the moon is put into orbit, and it's put there for timekeeping purposes. What's fascinating about this is that that seems to be the truth. Because what happens is that suddenly everybody, and I mean everybody, has a 12-month calendar consisting of 30 days each. Now, this right now, mainstream will say, well, it's kind of 30 days. It's not really 30 days, and it's not. Right? That's not what the moon is right now. However, our ancestors, during their period of time, it appears that the moon's orbit was a legitimate, precise 30 days. This is why they ended up basing their calendar on the newly arrived moon, because it was accurate. There is no reason for a single ancient culture to utilize a lunar calendar if the lunar calendar would have been based off of what our moon does right now. It wouldn't make any sense because it doesn't work. The calendar would be thrown off immediately, right? Like a 6-year-old would be able to tell that your calendar is trash. Okay, so there would be no reason to use it like that. People would have had to have done something else. Now, mainstream historians will immediately say, well, they would just add some days here or there, epigamical days or whatever. That didn't happen until later. That does not happen until another catastrophe hits Earth. Until the next catastrophe hits Earth, the moon appears to be in a perfect 30-day orbit. And that is what everybody goes off of. And in fact, what's even more interesting is that after that cataclysm that alters the moon slightly a little bit, that screws with the orbit and it did to it what we see nowadays, that's when everybody suddenly, and I mean everybody across the planet, suddenly notices that their calendar is no longer accurate. Nobody notices that their 30-day calendar is inaccurate until this other cataclysm happens. How do you like that? Like, it's all right in front of us. Like, all of our history, all of our real history is like right here. And it's completely different than what we're taught. And nobody wants to pay attention to it because it sounds insane. And it only sounds insane because we have been taught to think that it is insane. It's almost like somebody's trying to hide something from us. Who would want to hide our history from us? I don't know, right? It's just a total mystery to me. Anyway, so we find a situation to where the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Chinese, the Hindus, Islam, Romans, Mayans, Mesopotamians, the Celts, essentially every culture on this planet will adopt a 30-day calendar at exactly the same time. It begs the question, why? As a mainstream historian, why did this happen? And they have no answer for it. But if we just listen to our ancestors, they simply say, hey, look, after a specific cataclysm, probably the Venus event, though I'm still open to stuff. I can't make that claim 100%. Well, maybe. We'll do another show on that later. We'll talk about that later. That'll be a fun one to do a thought experiment on. Anyway, so mainstream historians have no explanation for any of this. And what's even funnier is that they're in a really crappy position because, as far as we can tell, the 30-day calendar was used accurately, and then suddenly there is a panic point to where the calendar no longer works. Mainstream historians have no explanation for this, and because they can't explain it, they just ignore it. If you've never seen a historian try to explain any of this stuff, or they've just kind of shirked around the topic, that's why. Because the reality is right in front of them, and most of them can see it, by the way. Most of them are well aware of the problem, but they can't deal with it because their mainstream training literally does not allow it. They cannot go and say, oh, wait a second, let me reevaluate this. Maybe there is something to this. They can't do that. They have to follow the theory of uniformity, right? Mainstream science is just one giant circle jerk. Everybody just calibrates off of each other, right? And everybody uses the theory of uniformity to explain everything, which puts all of mainstream science in a position to where they will never be able to figure out anything. And mainstream historians as well. Right, so if you want to gain power, this is how you divide and conquer, by the way. This is what's going on. Right? I'm not gonna sugarcoat it or anything. All of this is being done on purpose. I don't know what to tell people, right? It's right there. Okay, anyway. So, with all that said with respect to the moon, we have to actually deal with the elephant in the room. And that elephant is, everybody seems to say that the moon was placed into orbit as if it was put there artificially. This is where things get insane. We have a weird situation when we look back at really ancient history. There's not a ton of stories about it, and the ones that we do have, in all honesty, when we look back at ancient history, we find a situation to where humans are always created. And humans are always created by some kind of other being. Now, what this implies is that potentially another, let's just say, humanoid kind of race created humans for their own purposes, and then everything went to hell in a handbasket at some point in time in history. This is a common theme that we find in cultures who have a history that go back far enough. Now, I'm not going to go crazy. I'm not even going to... That's out of scope for this topic, but I wanted to throw that out there because the moon's existence really does seem artificial. Now, this will be a little bit of speculation, but this is all based on history and science, everything I'm about to say. And I don't necessarily hold an opinion on any of this right now, so just to keep everything level, as far as I'm concerned, we don't have a solid answer for some of this stuff. We have some good directions, and that's what I want to talk about. So the moon's mere existence is strange beyond belief. There are all kinds of weird facts about the moon that make zero sense with respect to astrophysics, physics in general, and possibilities. Let's go over some of those. The moon, for some weird reason, is able to achieve a perfect solar eclipse alignment. The reason why it's able to do this is because the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but also 400 times closer to Earth. This is a near perfect ratio and, in fact, was probably perfect just a couple of thousand years ago. And what this does is that it allows the moon to appear as the same size as the sun in the sky. This is why we are able to get total eclipses. Now, we take total eclipses for granted in today's day and age. We just think it's normal because, well, it is for us, right? This stuff happens all the time. But when you look around the solar system, this does not exist anywhere. There is no such thing as a smaller body which can perfectly eclipse the sun relative to its host body. It does not exist. Now, why is that? Right? It's just something to think about. Another interesting aspect of this situation is that we now know that the moon is slowly moving away from the Earth. What this means is that potentially the moon would have been closer to the Earth only a few thousand years ago. This can be proven scientifically. Now, of course, NASA and astronomers don't really want to discuss that, but if the moon is currently moving away, that immediately means that it was closer not that long ago. What that entails then is that the 30-day lunar calendar could have been precisely accurate during the time that all of our ancestors claim that it was used because it was accurate. Now, another interesting thing to note is the tidal locking of the moon. Another thing we just take for granted. Tidal locking is essentially where we only ever see one face of the moon, right? We see the man on the moon, that face that looks down on us with disgust and irritation because everybody down here is failing and, the moon is just sickened by our actions. It's pretty embarrassing if you think about it. Anyway, the moon is tidal locked. That is a weird situation to find out within the solar system. There are a few other tidally locked moons, but to get the moon to be tidally locked to a planet the size of Earth is a weird situation. Now, you can come back and say, well, there's a few other moons out there which are tidally locked relative to their host body. Yeah, you're correct, but you'll notice that the bodies that those moons are tidally locked to are the size of something like Jupiter or Saturn. They are not the size of Earth. The fact that Earth somehow was able to control the moon and tidally lock it, that's a crazy situation. And right now, mainstream scientists have no explanation for why it is like this. Another very interesting thing that mainstream science acknowledges is that the moon does indeed stabilize the Earth's tilt. Without the moon, we would be tilting all over the place like I mentioned earlier. Even mainstream acknowledges that we would have to have the moon, otherwise the Earth would just be wobbling all over hell and back, and we would be living in a completely different situation. So isn't that fascinating that the moon showed up precisely at the time when we needed it to stabilize our planet after one hell of a catastrophe? It's either Earth is extremely lucky or potentially, I don't know, man. I mean, is there someone or something out there that has that kind of power that can show up and, can save humanity, basically? I mean, because that's what happened. right? That is literally what happened. If the moon had not shown up after the Venus event, let's just say it was the Venus event, humanity probably would have gone extinct. I doubt we would have survived what would have happened after that. I don't see how we could have. Well, I take that back. I can't make that claim for sure. But, the Earth would have just kept flipping over. It would have kept wobbling like crazy. Who knows what would have happened with its general orbit, right? I mean, even our orbit got stabilized during that period of time. It's a weird situation that we have to deal with there. And to make it even weirder, and I talked about this before, but it's worth mentioning again, is the fact that the moon also seems to help stabilize life on the planet. Right? That's another thing that's weird. Like, why the moon shows up right at the right time and it facilitates the continuation of humankind after a catastrophe that should have wiped it out. I'm not saying by the way, remember, I'm not religious. I don't believe in a God, so we don't need a God to do any of this. But it does beg the question, is it possible that our ancestors who claim that humans are a creation of some other kind of a humanoid, had those humanoids still hanging around and for whatever reason decided to try to help us out as Earth was going through all of that destruction? That's a topic for another subject, or topic for another show, but think about that, right? I mean, the science is there. The history is there. If we just follow the history and the science and the chronology, if we follow those three topics and just take them seriously, the ramifications are fairly extreme. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're religious or atheist. The conclusions are fascinating. All right, yeah, we're coming to the end. I'll wrap it up. I know, I've talked enough. The moon is crazy. The moon is a weird situation in history. So when you guys are doing your studies and when you're trying to figure stuff out, just keep in mind that the moon is a relatively new cosmological body with respect to human history. And human history, remember, is not that old. We do not have hundreds of thousands of years of history. We don't even have tens of thousands of years of history, and we do not need religious craziness to prove any of that. The science proves all of that. Remember, right now the mainstream uses the religious side of things to demonize anybody who starts to come to the conclusion that maybe humanity has not been around as long as mainstream says. Remember, it's a double-edged sword, and all that psychological propaganda is absolutely, just devastating the communities. Don't fall for it. Just keep an open mind. Don't worry about being called a crazy person. Anybody who calls you crazy, just ignore them. It doesn't matter. Like, those people, they don't matter. Like, you can just get rid of those people because those people are psychologically gone, and you are not obligated to try to convince them of anything. So don't worry about it. Anyway, so that's the moon. Those are the crazy aspects of the moon. Keep this in mind. Just while you guys are doing your ancient research, if you get rid of the concept of the moon being millions and billions of years old, and you just listen to real history, suddenly everything changes, and you might actually find something that you are working on will now suddenly start to make sense if you are willing to admit that the moon is a relatively new body in the sky for humans. We'll continue to build up our case for this stuff, but I just wanted to build a small foundation just to prove scientifically and historically that paying attention to the moon being a new cosmological body is extremely important. And the ramifications go far beyond just, general history. I mean, the moon's mere existence might actually prove that there is something else going on this planet and in this solar system, and we are not being told what it is, but it might be right there in front of us. To make matters even worse is that there are probably people on this planet who are well aware of all of this, and they're hiding it from us. And they're not doing it for our safety, but they are doing it so that they can continue to exploit us for their own gain. Stop buying into their garbage. Open up your mind and listen to what our ancestors said about the past. I've had insomnia for like 3 weeks. I gotta go to bed. I'm going to sleep. I am gonna go try and pass out.